I think we should say something about what brings all three of us to this conversation, because you're a greener, we're greeners, different positions, but I think we're all believers in some part of the Evergreen model that is not known in the outside world.
So why did you choose Evergreen?
The model of what Evergreen was doing is just remarkably different from really any other school. You know, any other liberal arts college, and certainly than any other research university, which Evergreen is not. You know, I got the job, we came out here, Bret got on faculty shortly thereafter, and in some ways we never looked back.
You guys were all in.
Well, you know, it's funny, Evergreen has strengths that are not widely known, and I think Heather probably appreciated them better than I did before we got here, because she had visited the place. But the freedom that one has teaching at Evergreen is literally unparalleled by any other institution that I think either of us are aware of. And that freedom, if you are not inclined to value it, is really just an annoyance. But if you are inclined to want to do something different in the classroom, there's no other place to be. It really opens up the door to innovating entirely new pedagogical structures. And so I think very quickly after arriving, the sense was it's very hard to go teach somewhere else, because what we have learned to do and learned to enjoy is just not possible.
So I remember being on the airplane out here and trying to figure out what this crazy place was, because it's hard to describe, and it doesn't do a good job of advertising itself, I think. And I was looking through the catalog, and I found this program. So, you know, we do these full-time programs where, as you know, Benjamin, students are all in, right? They're taking one 16-credit thing at a time. Maybe it's for 10 weeks, maybe 20 weeks, maybe the full academic year. And it just allows you to build community. And, you know, we didn't know any of that at first. And, but this program that I found, I think it was called Centering. And it was co-taught by an artist and a physicist, mathematician. You know, both of them do a lot of things, as most faculty at Evergreen do. And it was nominally on the art and science of pottery. So for me, as a scientist and a potter, this held real appeal. And I'm looking at this going, oh my God, this is exactly what appeals to me actually about the art of pottery, especially if you're wheel throwing, which is, you know, what's the chemistry of the clay? What's the physics of the forces of the clay on the wheel? What happens to glazes in terms of the chemistry in the kiln? And what makes forms beautiful? And, you know, what is the difference between functional and non-functional art? You know, all of these questions are actually intrinsic when you're making pottery, and some people don't care about the science of it, and some people don't care potentially to think about, you know, function versus non-function in terms of the art. But the idea of a program that brings together all of those pieces in one was remarkable, and I think it's what a lot of us looked for when we ourselves were in school, was a way to integrate all the different pieces that we were learning. And so here at Evergreen, you get faculty who say, oh, I actually care about this, and I'd love to bring that together. Let's see if I can find someone with whom I can teach, and then we can create a community of like-minded, interested people with whom to build emergent content together.
Yeah, one of the things that was really attractive to Evergreen for me was that you have knowledge, you know, you learn the different kinds of knowledge, like the aesthetic knowledge, and then the physical or the scientific knowledge, or the abstract knowledge. But you can combine both of those into a practice, and like put those two things, like with pottery, for that course, or with me, like making fiction. So I study how fiction's written, and then I study how people think about fiction, and then I produce fiction. So I do all those things, and then I get in contact with faculty who are specialized in that and interested in that, and they can help guide me or give me feedback on a very high level that I'm not going to get at a creative writing.
And there's an advantage to it that's not obvious, which is, even if you study something that you don't deploy in your life after college, this is instead of being reductionist and narrow, which is the direction the academy's gone in recent decades, it's synthetic and broad. And you know, we teach evolutionary biology, but we are not under the misapprehension that most of the people that we are teaching are going to go on to be evolutionary biologists, because we know full well they won't. There isn't room. It's not a huge discipline. And so anyway, we're teaching them the material because it's interesting, because it's useful to them in their lives to know what kind of creature they are and why they're wired in the way they are. But once you've learned to think about a topic really deeply on multiple levels, then what you have is a model about how to think about something that's complicated. And what that means is that you can take what you learn sorting through evolutionary puzzles or sorting through pottery from a physics level and a chemistry level, and you can take that model for how you would approach the problem and how you would sort it out, and you can now apply it to some puzzle that you never took a program in at Evergreen or anywhere else, and you can do it right because you've seen how it was done and what you did with the roadblocks and all of that. So in some ways, when Evergreen works, it is the ultimate model for generating insight and for arming students with a toolkit that allows them to navigate the world with a kind of power that just doesn't come out of narrow study.
Yeah. And like you were saying, with the time span of a program, and like just you're so in it, so on top of knowledge and practice and thinking about things and learning about things, that way you're learning alongside people, like over the course, and everybody's on kind of the same page, as insofar as everybody is on the same page from their different viewpoints.
Yeah,
so.
And I mean, I think one thing that both Bret and I do on pretty much the first day of every program is start by saying, yes, you know, I'm the one up here who is being paid to be up here, but don't trust me. Don't trust me because I'm up here. I have to earn your trust. We all have to earn each other's trust. It's better if we start from an assumption that we are trustworthy, but you should question everything that comes out of my mouth until I have said enough things that you have independently checked against your own knowledge, against what you know to be true, against other smart people's claims, such that now we can engage in conversation together that is, you know, good faith and rigorous. And from there, then, as people start to come on board, and you know, it's rare that people don't come on board to this because it's actually a respectful, engaging, and inclusive model, which starts from a place of please do dissent. Right? We are going to have a conversation. Please do dissent from anything, you know, about anything that you hear that doesn't sound right, and we'll go there. Like let's talk about what it is that doesn't feel right to you, and we do, right? So it's rare for any 2 or 3 hour lecture, and our lectures are very interactive, and they're never sage on the stage style, to cover exactly what we imagined it would. Right? It never goes where we thought it would.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it never finishes at the time that we thought it would. You know, in terms of, okay, well, we'll pick this up next time, right? Because we have that time, because we're meeting so many hours a week and we're building community that it's not like, okay, well, I'll see you again for 1 hour in 3 days and then again for 1 hour in 4 days. We're deep in this community together, and especially with the Evergreen model that allows for these field trips or retreats, depending on what you want to call them, where, you know, we tend to do these week-long field trips early in every quarter where you're just in it together. We're cooking together, we're eating together, we're engaging in field exercises together, we're just sitting around talking both casually and sometimes more formally as well together, and learning about each other's developmental trajectories, how we came to be, you know, in this room together, how we came to be at Evergreen, how we arrived at this place in our lives together, and that creates the community and the trust that then allows us to dig deep and to push people on maybe some of their core beliefs that aren't that investigated, right? So when you run into ideology as opposed to well thought out, independently arrived at viewpoints, and you already have built trust, you can say, yeah, let's go deeper there. That isn't sounding right to me, and it works. Right, like that's conversation and dissent actually is possible in Evergreen programs and classrooms and field trips in a way that I think it's much harder to attain in a classic educational model where the professors really don't know the students. The TAs know the students, if anything, and the professors interact for 2 or 3 hours a week, and it's very sage on a stage style. In this era, teaching knowledge. Yeah. Wikipedia can do that for you, right? And Wikipedia is the place to start, not the place to end. You got to fact check your Wikipedia stuff. But if what you want to learn is basics of the cell cycle, for instance, you can probably get that elsewhere. You don't need to do that in real time with 50 other people. Whereas if you want to try to figure out how it is that we came to understand what the cell cycle looks like, for instance, and I picked that even though that's nothing that either of us really teach, then let's go into the philosophy of science, how it is that we make claims of truth, the history of how it is that we have actually made discoveries that we've made, what the dead ends have looked like, what it has looked like to back up, how hard it is for people to back off of conclusions that they have already come to and maybe even stake their careers on, or at a less fraught level, students who've staked, whole research papers on. If scientists are having to back off of claims that they've staked their careers on, certainly anyone in a classroom should be willing to back off of a claim and be willing to say, and in fact eager to say at the point that they're demonstrably wrong, oh, wow, I'm glad I know that now. I'm glad I didn't spend 5 years in graduate school, say, pursuing that thing when now I've discovered, oh, that didn't turn out to be true. Good. It hurts at a pride level briefly, but then it feels good, right? Like, oh, now I know what's not true and where not to spend further energy. And so we could do that in these classrooms, right, with people who, over time, almost everyone joins in, right? And everyone doesn't talk equally. I don't believe in that model. Everyone must talk and no one should talk more than others. That doesn't seem to match what the neurodiverse classrooms that we have are. But people join in and something will grab their attention and they jump into the conversation and then realize, oh, I can actually test my own assumptions against these tools, this toolkit and these models that we're learning here and become a better informed, more rigorous, and also more compassionate citizen of the world.
Yeah, more connected.
Yeah.
So I would add two things. One having to do with getting people involved in the conversation in a deep way, which is that I'm sure you would agree that very often, although people do ultimately come in on the conversation, the first thing you detect is that they don't quite trust the invitation, that they've been trained not to ask difficult questions in their educational environments up to the point that you meet them, often because professors and high school teachers and the like don't like to be asked questions that they don't know the answer to, that is somehow taken to be an indicator of a failure of their education, which is preposterous in biology in particular, because biology is an impossibly large field. Nobody can be expert in all of it, and so you should expect to be asked these questions all the time. And the most useful thing that can happen for students is either if they have a program with two professors, that the professors don't agree on something important and they can watch how the professors navigate that, or that even in the case of a one professor program, if the professor doesn't know the answer to the question but can say, I don't know the answer to the question, but here's how I would approach figuring out what the answer was, here are the predictions that I would make based on what I do know, that is empowering in a way that simply learning knowledge, facts, is not. So it's a very useful property of an education that is not easily found elsewhere.
Let me add here that this is actually particularly easy, I think, for us when we teach together because we're married, and we make that clear to students on day one, and many of them know that anyway, and we disagree, right? We disagree in front of them about questions of intellectual content. Right? About how best to approach a question, about whether or not a prediction would actually be the thing that you should pursue in order to address a particular hypothesis. And the fact of us disagreeing with respect and with love in front of students allows them to separate the disagreement is about dislike or about hostility from disagreement is about an honest attempt to understand what is true. And so, assuming that we are what we appear and actually, happily married people, yes, it's very important that we disagree and that we not obscure the fact that we disagree in order to actually refine our understanding of what the universe looks like. So this is the model that we hope for whenever we teach with anyone, but it's particularly easy to make the point to students when it's two people whom they know don't have a hidden hostility for one another, right?
The other thing I would say is that fields differ a great deal on how much room there is for disagreement. So in biology, we're in a very different place than we would be in chemistry or even physics, where, if you look at what we understand about chemistry, it tops out at some level, but that level is really high. We know a great deal about why things interact the way they do in a beaker under different sorts of conditions. We know we can predict what sort of compounds will come out of a particular reaction. And so we can be nearly encyclopedic in chemistry, and rightly so, but we should never be nearly encyclopedic in biology because it is so complex and there are so many different creatures that show different patterns that we don't know most of what we will ultimately know about biology. So the idea that in an Evergreen program we have room to acknowledge what is not known, and that in some places that's the bulk of what there is to know, that is extremely empowering. And once students get the idea that this is a landscape that we're going to explore together, and yes, we bring special tools that we spent decades putting together and figuring out, but that we're going to be like a guide in a forest. When a guide takes you into the Amazon or some other forest, they can't say that they don't know why everything is the way it is. Nobody on Earth understands the way a forest works. We know certain things and we don't know other things. And so anyway, we become like expert guides in a landscape that is mostly mysterious and novel, and that's just very empowering for students.
So I think that's a wonderful analogy, which I don't know that you've made before, in part because when you go into the Amazon, we've taken students to the Amazon, and we've our tropical rainforests are sort of one of our homes professionally, and we've seen a lot of amazing organisms there, but on any given day in the Amazon you have no ability to predict what you're going to see, right? You can hope, you can say, okay, I'm more likely to see squirrel monkeys than howler monkeys in this particular place and in these particular circumstances, but you can't actually predict it. And so like a classroom, if you are open to letting the community of people that you're in that classroom with, which is to say the students and faculty alike, drive the conversation and co-figure out what it is that we're most interested in doing that day, you can't necessarily guarantee that you're going to see parrots that day, right? You can't necessarily guarantee. I mean, you could be sort of the authoritarian top-down and say, we're going to get to this thing today because we need to, and sometimes you do. Like, actually, in order to do the workshop we're doing later today, we're going to need to cover something, right? But in general, if you can sort of have the freedom to go, we're in this space together. We're in this educational space where we're exploring ideas and we're developing evolutionary toolkit through throwing out ideas and seeing how you would know if that were true. Let us just try to figure out how you would know if that were true. It's similar to walking into the Amazon and going like, okay, maybe you have in your head today that you want to see pygmy marmosets. Let's think about how it is that we can maximize our chance of finding pygmy marmosets, but there's still no guarantee. So it is you spend enough time in the Amazon, you'll see pygmy marmosets. You spend enough time in evolutionary toolkit space, you're going to end up going down a lot of fascinating both dead ends and non-dead ends. But on any given day, at any given moment, you can't necessarily predict what and when. And that's part of the fun, right? That's part of what makes it reasonable and exciting to show up on any given day and go like, I don't know what's going to happen here, but I'm going to learn something that I didn't expect.
So that freedom and that exploration, that openness, there's a large chance for things to fail, or things to go wrong.
Absolutely.
Like whether within any given classroom or any given program over the course of 6 weeks or whatever, where you as a student you go in and you're like, you can tell by the first week you're like, oh man, how did I get into this thing, and try to maximize it. So the freedom allows you to kind of try to maximize it and stuff, but there's also the potential for the freedom for no rigor to be at Evergreen, or a very softball kind of education.
Well, let's separate two things. Yeah. First of all, one of the things that students often need to be talked through is that people who succeed in doing something novel tend to have a very unusual relationship with what is otherwise called failure. In other words, you have to have a certain taste for it or you can't go anywhere new, because failure happens to you many times before you succeed. So if that dissuades you, you're just done. So there's a difference between productive failure and useless failure. And Evergreen has useless failure occur regularly, but it is important to compare it to other colleges. When Evergreen fails, when a program doesn't work, it's more conspicuous than when a class doesn't work at another school because it's 16 credits, it's full time. And so that's an awful lot of time wasted in one endeavor. But is the amount of wasted effort at Evergreen greater than another college? I actually doubt that that's the case. Most college classes don't transform your life. They're supposed to, and it's great when they do, but that's actually not, it's not that you go to college at, whatever the other, ideal comparison college would be. And it's not that you go there and every class changes the way you think. Lots of them are not memorable, and 5 years after you're done, you'd have to work hard to figure out what you got from it. And then some of them succeed spectacularly. And so Evergreen is that way, but it's more conspicuous when it goes awry. That said, there's a lot that could be done at Evergreen to increase the rate at which we succeed.
Mm-hmm.
I would also add that one thing that I think we've said when we've taught together, one of the assignments that we like to give is something called Learn a Skill, where we set students to learn something of the physical universe in 10 weeks. And we ask them to spend X number of hours a week on it. That varies somewhat, and there are a couple check-ins along the way in which they speak to the class about where they are in the process. And it really matters far less what the thing is and how much progress they make towards it. The point is that they learn something about their own motivational structure and their understanding of the complexity of things in the world, such that they do not take for granted the real work that is going around them, that they may imagine takes nothing, right? So what we tend to say, I'd say halfway or so through these quarter-long projects, is, a number of students at that point go, I failed. I tried this thing, I tried it, and I tried it, and I tried it, and it's not working, I failed. And my feeling about that is, if you tried and you failed, that doesn't count as failure, because you learn from the attempt. Failing to fail, which is to say, not getting there because you didn't do it at all, because you woke up and it was week 6 and you realized you missed all of your deadlines, that's actually, that's the kind of failure that isn't useful and is going to be a decent predictor of, you're not going to end up getting done what you want to do in the world if that's what you do, right? If what you do is not do. So failing to fail, not okay. Failing and learning from it, great. So what if you didn't actually learn carpentry or any of the other skills? Programming or because frankly 10 weeks probably isn't enough if you're trying to do it part-time, but you can develop some skills, and more to the point, you can see what your own brain tells you about the various steps along the way. Mm-hmm. How much does it congratulate you when you have a success, which may have been due to luck, right? And how much does it put you down when you have a failure, which also may have been due to luck? Learning to separate out the luck from the actual skill and moving forward is the important lesson.
Yeah, at Evergreen, SAT scores and that kind of knowledge matters far less than motivation.
Yes.
And motivation is absolutely key.
It's the key.
If you are not, as a student, if you're not motivated, it's totally not worth your time.
Exactly.
To go there. But if you are motivated, it's really what Evergreen. Like, you can get away with nothing,
right,
or you can get away with anything. You can really get away with
as a student or a professor.
As
I
a
have
professor,
to say,
yeah.
There are professors who take the freedom and abuse it, and there are professors who take the freedom and run with it. And the thing is, you want to stay away from the ones who are using it as a way to minimize the amount of work they have to do, and you want to go towards the ones who are using it as license to find new ways of thinking and doing things. And the surprising thing is, if you find somebody who knows something important, cares about students, and is eager to figure out how to use the freedom to teach better, it almost doesn't matter what their subject is. You can learn from them, and it will be interesting, even if it's not the thing that you would have hoped to go study. Mm-hmm. So it's a very interesting, noisy environment, but it's a very interesting environment if you have the right skills to utilize it.
It's very experimental, not only in its founding, but like in every class, it's like a new experiment. Every program is a new experiment.
That's right.
In a way.
And that's even true. It's even true when you teach nominally the same thing multiple times. Yeah. So
There is no the same thing,
Right.
because it's a different group of students.
Right. The emergence that happens has everything to do with who walked through the door.
Yeah. And so the traditionally good student who was rewarded in high school for rote memorization and for sitting face forward and paying attention and being polite and all, is typically going to be the student who, at the point that the conversation appears to be meandering, but actually we're developing logical skills, will want to say, and we get this precious little at Evergreen, but still occasionally we do, is this going to be on the test? Right? So that classic question doesn't really work in most Evergreen programs because we're not, at least we don't, we don't teach to the test. We don't do in-class tests hardly at all anyway, but take-home exams in which you're thinking through complex, sometimes purely hypothetical scenarios, but in which you need to apply evolutionary and ecological realities to some fictional thing and figure out what is most likely to be the case. There is no, is this going to be on the test? If that's the question that's running in your head as you're sitting in class, you'd probably do better somewhere else. And not to say that you couldn't be welcomed into the fold by just sitting in your discomfort, right? Like, be uncomfortable. Be uncomfortable with the fact that you aren't really sure what this is. This doesn't feel like any other educational experience I've had. But I'm watching people come alive around me, and somehow it's not hard, mostly, to convince people to turn off their gadgets and to participate in conversation for a few hours. That, to me, speaks volumes right there. That in these situations, people seem actually hungry for the opportunity to sit with people that they don't know at first and come to know over time and talk about ideas, even if those ideas aren't ones that they initially thought they were most interested in.
But that brings up another problem. How do you quantify?
How do you assess?
How do you assess somebody's knowledge with that? If there's no tests, if there's no grades, how do you do that?
Here's the thing. We generally, educationally, get focused on assessment, and we convince ourselves that we are doing a good job of it. Now, when somebody is not paying attention in class, if somebody's really just, it's not working for them, you can spot that. And if somebody's doing really well, they're excited about the material and they're thinking about it outside of class, and they come to you and they talk to you about various things, that's obvious too. But there's a vast middle ground where it's very hard to quantify what's going on. And we have narrative evaluations at Evergreen, which we write at the end of the term. I don't know a single professor who likes doing it, but I know many professors who would defend it because it gives you the opportunity to do a better job of saying what a person accomplished, how they grew, than imagining that you can take somebody's learning in a particular topic and assign 85%. 85% of what exactly, right? 85% of the answers on the test were right according to the key is not a good indicator of how much they learned, especially if you're teaching something deep. There's no guarantee that the benefit of that thing won't primarily emerge 6 months after they've walked out of the classroom. Right? They're still thinking about it.
We know this happens. We hear this from students all the time who come back 6 months, a year, 5 years later and say, got it. Like I'm using this every day.
In fact, I had a wonderful conversation yesterday. A student, marvelous student, who went with us to Ecuador, not last spring, but the spring before, happened to be in town, and we got together for a couple hours, and he was telling me about the first program that I had been in with him, and he was reminding me that there had been a circumstance at the beginning of that program in which I had presented a concept that's very familiar to Heather and my students, about understanding that quite literally a human being, every other mammal, every vertebrate, is in fact as much a fish as a guppy if one applies a definition of fish that is the equivalent of saying mammal or saying bird. If you imagine fish is the same kind of category, then you are one. It's a tough concept, but if presented well, lots of students get it pretty quickly. And the student was,
and it makes for a good party trick.
It's a pretty good party trick because it isn't well, you're a fish because we're going to define fish in a special way. It's like, no, actually, logically, this is where you would come out, which is why it's cool, because it's surprising. anyway, the student was telling me that he had been frustrated because he had gotten the answer pretty quickly, as had many of the people in the class, and there was one student who wasn't getting it and was detaining the class because he was fighting back. And anyway, this student was telling me that at the time he had been very frustrated, but that after the dust had settled on the program, he realized that it had been the most important thing. That the fact that he had gotten the answer superficially was not an indicator that he had deeply understood it. And so it was sort of like, yes, he had gotten it at the level that he could have answered it correctly on the test. But understanding the deep implications of this point, there's no amount of time is too much. You can start with this point and you can reach everything else from it. And so anyway, he was reflecting on how much more deeply he understood the depth of the argument and the implications of the argument. But at the time he had been frustrated by feeling like, well, okay, got it, fish, you know.
Yeah.
To me, that's what means that's what the humanities are, and it seems like it's caked in. The humanities are caked into any topic, any STEM field.
Yeah,
Evergreen
absolutely.
Within this model.
Yeah, and I would so Bret and I nominally teach the same stuff sometimes together, but we have very different teaching styles and also different relationship with assessment. So I do tend to do assessment. Rarely is it explicitly quantitative. I've taught statistics, I've taught comparative anatomy where we have lab practicals, and it is a matter of like, did you know the name of that muscle or didn't you? But those are by far not my favorite things to teach. And so when we're doing evolutionary theory, tropical biology, animal behavior, these sorts of, there are methods that you should use, but when you veer from them, you have to have a very good explanation for why you would veer from them. And there is primary literature, some of which is good, much of which isn't. You need to figure out how to assess on your own when you're looking at a paper that's making sense and that is logically sound, and when you're looking at a paper that doesn't. I do tend to do a fair bit of assessment, which just means I do a lot more reading of student papers and giving them feedback on not just how sound their writing is, but mostly how sound their thinking is. Do these points logically flow? Here's an error. You go from A to E, and that would make sense, but for the fact that B to C, that didn't make sense. You're going to have to go back there, and that's going to mean that you can't get to E. You're going to have to go somewhere else as a result. We do that in real time in class, but I also do a lot of that through paper feedback and such, which is in some ways a traditional way of giving feedback, more so in the humanities than typically in the sciences, but it's through these creative and new, and both of us do this, these creating of hypotheticals where we say, this might be true. What would you need to know in order to assess if this is true? And it's the sort of thing where there are plenty of wrong answers, and you can just immediately see the wrong answers if you know how to play with the logic. And there are fewer right answers, but often, the fun of this, in fact, the student who Bret met with yesterday, I remember reading his work, often being like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. That's great. When I wrote this question, and I wrote up my own key, which is to say one answer that to me would completely address the complexities that I introduced in this question, it never occurred to me that you could go that direction, and yet this works. So that's, the assessment often involves how creative, how willing to put themselves out there intellectually in terms of risks was this person, and how creative were they in coming up with answers that often no one else had come up with. And not everyone can come up with new answers all the time, but being willing to try, I think, is a sure sign of being ready to engage the world rigorously.
So I want to distinguish between two things. The thing I'm skeptical of is assessment. The thing I'm not skeptical of is feedback. Feedback is the most important thing. Heather's much better at giving feedback than I am. I use other tools because I'm not good at dealing with a stack of papers and getting to the depth of where the little errors are. So I use other tools, but feedback is extremely important for the student in order for them to learn to think more clearly, which is really at some level the point of the whole exercise to begin with. it is the sense that the purpose of a college education is to figure out exactly what a person understands and report it to the outside world. This seems to me like part of a mythology that the purpose of college is to make you employable, which, you know, college has to make you employable at some level as long as our system looks this way. But its primary purpose should be to increase the quality of your thinking, which will make you more employable, but it will also allow you to navigate parts of your life that have nothing to do with employment. And so, anyway, what I'm skeptical of is that our job as professors is to tell the world what you know so it can figure out what to pay you for and how much. So it's the idea of putting a number on it that allows two people from two different institutions to be compared by some metric. I think it's nonsense, and I think it just can't be done, and frankly, we professors ought to get over it. That is not to imply anything negative about high-quality feedback, which is, of course, the whole basis for course correction, is knowing what you could have done better and then doing it better the next time.
And learning how to receive feedback.
Right.
Yes.
So that it isn't personal.
Yeah.
It may be personally tailored, but the point is it's not a judgment on you.
Yeah.
It's a judgment on what you did, which allows you to get better. And, you know, trying to protect your ego from feedback is insane, because really what you want is to take the lesson, however difficult it may be, so that for the rest of your life you can, you know, achieve more of what you want to achieve.
This is someplace, though, that I find very often the first time I give feedback to especially a student who already knows what they're doing, like who already knows how to write, at least has the fundamentals of writing, and maybe is already familiar with the primary scientific literature enough that they know how to find papers. I give them, it's easier for me to give them feedback than someone who really doesn't know what they're doing, right? And so I tend to give them a lot of feedback, and often the first thing I'll hear is, whoa, no one ever criticized me before. Like, I was always told that I just was doing awesome. And very occasionally they persist in that, like, how could you possibly be criticizing me? I've always been told I'm awesome. But the vast majority of people very quickly say, and thank you. Like, thank you, because I know I'm skilled. Like, I know I'm good at this, but I also know I couldn't possibly be as good as I could hope to be. And, you know, if that's true, why am I here? You know, am I not trying to better myself and inform myself of things that I don't already know, and to exactly be in the discomfort and figure out what else I could learn? And so it is often the students who have always been told by the system that they're just fine, and frankly the system doesn't have time to deal with them because they're doing fine. It's those students who are the most eager to actually get careful, you know, generous but critical feedback that says, you know, all these things terrific, but here in paragraphs 2 and 5 you made logical errors that render the entire thing actually not tenable. And yeah, I know that's shocking at first, but people who actually care about reason and, you know, beauty and logic and truth actually want to know how to get there more effectively. Not necessarily more efficiently, but more effectively.
It seems that Evergreen as a college has reached a point this year of receiving a certain sort of feedback.
Yes.
At least from the outside world.
Which it is attempting to reject.
Yes. So I was wondering, I mean, it seems like the system itself has produced a certain sort of resonance that has gained a lot of attention to it, specifically negative attention.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think that, like, I've been trying to evaluate my education, and by evaluating, by being very critical, by giving the institution and certain people within the institution very pointed feedback.
Yes.
And I don't know if they're necessarily amenable to that, or if that's a good thing for them to receive or not. But I think that when a system like Evergreen has something that happens that's as messy and noisy, it's a call to look in to what's going on. I was wondering if you guys have any thoughts on that.
I'll start.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, we've become a laughingstock. Rightly so. Not because of what Evergreen actually stands for and can be, but because what happened at the end of spring quarter was lunacy, right? It was madness. We descended into madness, and the official responses didn't make sense. So, yeah.
I just want to quantify that madness wasn't just the students, this band
By
of Mary
far
Magdalene
not.
students.
In fact, primarily I did not put that on the students. And that's maybe a conversation for another time. But But definitely not. The fact that it was mostly students who were in the videos that went viral, and it was the students who posted those videos that went viral, made it really easy to point the finger at a small minority of vocal students and say, this is ridiculous. And it was ridiculous, but I don't think it was primarily the students' fault, nor frankly, was it particularly organic what happened here. I will say, for everything that we've said positive about what Evergreen can do and has done and we have done here, the last thing I want to appear to be is an apologist for Evergreen. I think I love this college kind of like I love my country, and that doesn't mean that what has happened to the principles of the Founding Fathers who wrote the Constitution isn't akin to what has happened to the principles of the founding faculty of Evergreen. The country has gone awry, and so has Evergreen at this point. And it didn't start last year at Evergreen, and what's been happening to the country didn't start either at the election in 2016 or 8 years earlier or 20 years earlier, or whenever you want to start it. There's a slow creep away from founding values, and with it a forgetting of what it was that made both the United States so unique in its time and so forward-thinking, and what made Evergreen so unique in its time and forward-thinking in terms of unhinging faculty from the responsibility towards their fields and allowing faculty to dive deep with students in these full-time communities and really develop relationships and therefore learn together. Evergreen has amazing potential, and at the moment we appear to be going in exactly the opposite direction.
So do you believe that what happened this year was inevitable with the model of Evergreen?
No.
Okay.
No.
So Evergreen, the model, did not produce this.
Well, I want to just clean up a couple things so we don't get ourselves in trouble. The country has gone awry. It started awry. But the founders knew that. So we have to distinguish between the founders' principles, which were deeply forward-thinking and, despite what people say, a true experiment in democratizing power, not a perfect experiment. And, of course, the very fact that they effectively grandfathered in slavery means that the project was never in motion in the right direction. But the founders knew that, and they did it because they couldn't have founded the nation having not done it, or at least that was their understanding. And so it eventually boiled over famously, but it effectively had to. What happened at Evergreen is a little different because so first of all, the college was founded around perfectly radical ideas, and I don't mean that in a political sense, though they may have been that as well. They were radical ideas in the sense of a complete departure from the academic model that the rest of the academy was functioning on. And so they threw out everything. And some of the stuff they threw out needed to be thrown out, but the way they threw it out wasn't perfect. Some of it was brilliant. Full-time programs, really, I can't see a more forward-thinking model. But in any case, in both the case of the nation and the college, there has been ironically, a conservatism about changing that which is clearly wrong, which has gotten in the way, and it has allowed pressure to build up that didn't need to. Evergreen could have been reformed into a brilliant model from a very forward-thinking but flawed model, and instead we have treated the founders' wisdom as close to sacred, and then eventually the ricketiness of some of the ideas resulted in an opening. And what really happened at Evergreen is, we brought in an outsider. Our new president has only been here 2 years, and the amount of change that has taken place in that time period is jaw-dropping. It is a change, I think, in every single case, away from the best stuff about Evergreen. It's a change away from full-time programs. It's a change away from faculty autonomy. It's a change from all of the stuff that works, and all of it has been dressed up, almost all of it has been dressed up as necessary to reach equity, which you've pointed out in other videos that you've put out is a term that is not well defined and is We are told it is not the same thing as equality. We are not told what it is. And what it is appears to be pretty ironic from the point of view of what people take equity to mean in common parlance. So what I would say is, yes, this was needless. Some of what should have happened was already failing to happen before Bridges ever showed up. We should have corrected our model for hiring faculty and for recruiting students a decade ago. It was obvious that it needed to be done, and we didn't do it. But that created an opening for a president who wished to transform Evergreen into something that it wasn't meant to be and that it wouldn't be especially good at, and a constituency amongst the faculty that wished to transform Evergreen into some, I say ironically, a utopian experiment, which of course has descended into dystopia, as all utopian experiments do.
So we were talking about freedom and rigor, and like there seems to be a necessary balance between you can do anything, but you need to do something, and how you go about doing something, and that can be abused as well as taken advantage of, not only in the classroom, but perhaps with regards to what students you bring in and how you sell the place with the students. And I saw a marked turn in the 4 years or 4.5 years that I was there in the quality of the discussions that I was having during seminar. And I did basically all humanities as rigorously as possible. And it was not all the time, but the discussions tended towards, like, well, it's all subjective, it's all taste, you can find whatever you want to find beautiful, and it was frustrating to me to be in a classroom with people who didn't seem like they really wanted to attack things and really like get into deep necessary minutia of what we were studying, and it seems like the trade-off with that is that all of that energy on like say poetry is now transferred onto this social energy, or like going through and criticizing how people think, or like looking at like who's the purest person in the room, and reordering classroom not by mastery of material but by your oppression quotient or whatever.
Yep.
Yes. It was really frustrating, really tragic to me.
Yeah.
That's where it seems to have gone, especially in the last 2 years.
I think so. It's all of us romanticize the past a little bit, right? I started out decades ago actually as a literature major. I wanted to be a fiction writer as well, and I ran away in the late 80s, early 90s because at that point, what we've started referring to as PC 1.0, political correctness 1.0 was gaining ground on college campuses then, and those seminars were very much about "but I feel." And it doesn't matter what you think or what you're generating, how you're generating meaning from this thing that we're reading or this thing that one person has just read that they've written and we're now supposed to talk about it. It was entirely about lived experience, and all reality is subjective, which is a caricature but an apt one of some aspects of postmodernism, right? Which was gaining ground in the academy back then. And I ran away to science because I believe strongly in the power of narrative, but I would like my narratives to be testable. I would like to know when the narratives actually make sense and are better than other narratives, right? So that was going on back in the late 80s, early 90s, and it kind of disappeared from college campuses through, when we were in graduate school and our early time at Evergreen, we weren't seeing a lot of it. And I think at some level, the students who were in college back when we were in college have also grown up-ish and become faculty, and now we're in this PC 2.0 wave, where it's postmodernism even farther from what the actual legitimate origins of it were supposed to be. So critical race theory isn't falsifiable, it isn't testable, it's a stick with which to hit your opponents and to get them to shut up, rather than a way to actually create equity or equality or enhance diversity or even enhance understanding in the world. So I do think that there's been a change in the last 2 years, in the last 4 years, in the last 10 years, but I also don't think, there's not like a moment when we can point to and say, That's like, that's what happened then. It's been, it's a longer cycle than that.